we get practical, no BS insights on growing yourself and growing your career. On this episode, we're talking to Cam Beaudoin. Welcome, Cam. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Britta, thanks so much for having me on the show. First off, my name's Cam Beaudoin, and I am a professional speaker and show host on disability inclusion and really the business of accessibility and how that kind of intersects with the diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of realm at the moment.
Well, thanks so much for telling us about that. That was one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you. I myself am somebody with disabilities. It doesn't appear that way, but I have dyslexia and ADHD. And I find that a lot of people in the corporate sphere don't really know how to approach how to advocate for themselves. So I'm excited to talk about some of that and also your experience. So I'd like to start by just understanding a little bit about your career journey. And so if you could just give me like a brief synopsis of, how you got from here to there.
Sure. And I just want to mention that many people face the same kind of challenges, especially with invisible disabilities. And maybe you feel like you're always trying to validate why you need either accommodations or things like that. So I'm really looking forward to get into that a little bit. So my journey started, I was a software developer for a number of years, and I was brought into a large organization, but I was always given these projects around accessibility. So there's something called the accessibility guidelines, the web content.
Wait, let's pause you just for a second. There's something going on with your audio.
Check.
I don't know what's happening.
Can you hear me?
It's a little robot-y. I'm not sure what's going on.
Let's look at the settings here. This happens. It's okay. We'll figure it out. The auto gain.
Ooh.
High resolution audio.
We got it. We're sounding great.
Success. Hey, we did it on the fly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start that all over again.
Sure.
Rewind. Tell us about how you got to where you're at in your career.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I started off my journey as a developer for a large organization, large consulting firm, and they would always assign me these projects around digital accessibility. So making websites usable by people who use assistive technology. And that was kind of where I got everything started. What's funny is that they always put like the most junior developers on those types of tasks because the priority just wasn't there 9 years ago. And they said, well, let's just give this to the newbie guys. But I loved it. I excelled at it. I became a master at the accessibility guidelines. So what ended up happening was that anytime any project in the organization needed to have something for accessibility worked on, they came to me. So I became this valuable resource on that very specific specialty. And that's really something that I try to now encourage people to continue with. If you want to become an accessibility person, go be an expert in your field, go be an expert in whatever you're doing, and go become that go-to person. Then I met my friend Tom, and he's blind. And I met Tom the first time. He was like a traveling coach, trainer on accessibility and disability inclusion. And when my boss said hey, let's go meet Tom, my boss, who was that kind of A-type personality, suave, ex-consultant type of salesperson type of guy. And he walked up to Tom and stuck his hand in his face and said, Tom, great to meet you. My name's Jim. But Tom, being blind, had no idea there was a hand outstretched in front of him. I melted in embarrassment. I ran back to my desk. I got out of that situation, went to YouTube and typed in how to shake a blind person's hand.
Wow.
And what I learned was that all we need to do is just queue up and say, hey, Tom, my name's Cam. Can I shake your hand? Those words, can I shake your hand, was all I needed to do was to create an interaction and improve that interaction. And that really started to highlight to me that, okay, this is about the people. It's not about the technology. So from there, I pursued speaking. I hosted events at my organization and went into more consulting and more focus until I led a team up here in Canada at a bank. And recently just went off on my own to focus even more on that professional speaking, coming on as speaker in organizations to really help them either strategize on how to build their accessibility team or just kind of highlight accessibility in their organization and skilling up their own accessibility teams as well. So that's kind of where I came from and where I am now.
I love that. I love the point in the story about Tom. Mm-hmm. I love how you talk about how the only cue that he needed was just this very simple very like straightforward, phrase.
Right,
So,
right.
and a lot of these like adaptations or things that we can provide to others are just quite simple. Maybe talk a little bit more about that, how simple some of these solutions can be for us to advocate for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we try to solve everything all at once. When something is complicated, we don't understand, we kind of lump it into this part of our brain, which is like, I don't get that, so I'm just going to ignore it, right? Like, and that's very human. I would say, like, it doesn't matter what it is in life. If I started talking to you about, I don't know, astronomy, and you're just not into doing that, I could talk to you all I want about the comet that we could see right now in the sky with binoculars, but it's just gonna, like, I just
Mm.
don't care about that. But if we start to find really small nuggets of information or small tweaks to our own behavior, we can start to improve the lives of people around us. And it's just about being considerate to people around you as well.
Mm.
To anyone who may be listening who has a kid, that's something that's just so apparent. Like, right, we look at our kids and we say, why don't you just get that, right? But they don't know. They just do not know that they need to put on their jacket before putting on their boots. Like my son, he always puts his boots on first. I'm like, now you got to go take off your boots, go get your jacket. So it's these like little tweaks in behavior that we can do ourselves to just say, now whenever I tell my son, okay, time to get ready for school, don't forget, jacket, then boots. Look, all I need to do is just add that thing, jacket and boots. Then it cues him up to make these small behavioral changes in his path as well. We can take that same behavior to our careers or to our entrepreneurship, like whatever you want. So advocating for yourself, it's like queuing up your managers or your people around you and stuff like that. Just say, hey, I prefer this. Like, like we don't have to be shy. We don't have to make a big deal of it. Send a big email. Just say like, hey, I actually work better if I just have headphones on, if it's okay. Like, I'm just going to focus on work for the next hour. Talk to you at noon, right? Like we can just say these little small behavioral changes and do these, queue up these small habits that create just, benefits for ourselves and people around us as we go on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like that it's these like small, simple cues. The way sort of I come at this is I had a bad experience with a large, I worked for a large firm, not going to name names, obviously, but I was working there and it took me 6 months to get adaptive technology, like screen reader
Right.
technology. And what was so difficult is literally every week for 6 months, I was calling our IT department and asking, like, has this been approved yet? And approvals had to go all up and down the chain of command. So that by the end of 6 months, by the time I got the assistive technology, three people above me and three people below me knew that I had a disability. And it was so disheartening to have to out myself every single time, every
Mm-hmm.
week. And as much as people say they don't view you differently, this was many years ago when people really did view you differently, and I felt like I got treated with kid gloves or talked down to a lot because of having to out myself over and over again. And I really, so how would one advocate for themselves, maybe not necessarily in that situation, but let's say you're starting at a job, either you didn't tell them in the interview, but you know that you need XYZ or you work best in XYZ. How would you approach that?
See, what you're explaining to me right now is something that a lot of people encounter either in their employment. And what that really tells me is that the people that we're working for or working with don't have enough processes in place to be able to handle this properly, which also tells me that not enough of us who have disabilities, who have invisible disabilities, are out there trying to actively change. And I've met a lot of people with disabilities who say, we are advocates. We are advocates for people with disabilities, and I want to change the world. And that actually starts very locally, I feel, in organizations. And we need to learn to speak up and speak out and kind of going through that process. And that was uncomfortable for you. And that's something that, thanks for sharing that. But maybe the next person who comes along and asks for those accommodations, the people in HR, accommodations, whatever, workplace accommodations, will now have that quasi process kind of already ironed out. Like, oh yeah, we did that once already. Okay, now we have to go through it. Maybe it'll take only 4 people, and it's still too many people to go through. But after that, maybe it's only 2. Then maybe the process is kind of solidified and kind of like set into stone after that, and then all of a sudden it becomes something normal. So first thing I would say is that we have to speak about it. Don't lose heart. This is something that we all kind of go through, and this is something that many people before you and many people probably after you will have to go through as well.
Yeah.
but being persistent is the best line of defense, right? What you
Mhm.
said you did every single week, you had to go and send an email or request it again. And that is probably the best line. But I've spoken to people who have said, hey, I just gave up because I wasn't able to get the accommodations I needed. So whatever, I just figured it out on my own. And that sucks. That really sucks. There's no magic bullet in any organization to getting the right person on, but I firmly believe in escalations and saying, hey, I'm just going to CC your boss, because a lot of larger organizations have their org chart, right? CCing their
Yeah.
boss. And if you don't get any benefit there, being a little bit obtuse and saying, oh, you know what? I just CC'd your boss in this email, by the way. So just, whoops, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to.
Oh.
And not being accusatory thing, just saying like, CC and say like, hey, I've made this request a couple times. I just wanted to highlight that, and wondering what the status update on is that. Whoops, I
Mhm.
CC'd your boss with that too. You're never going to be told no to just like asking for a small request or update. So I like to go
Yeah.
through that process. I like to do that.
Yeah, I like that you talk about how advocacy starts locally, and um, you know, I think as someone, as someone who is somebody with, invisible disabilities, it does get scary to try to talk for yourself or to advocate for yourself. But to your point, nobody is going to create a process unless somebody starts that ball rolling, and you might be paving the way. And I know there's a lot of people that say, we shouldn't have to, but there's just no awareness. Like, right,
Right.
yes, we shouldn't have to, but also there's just no awareness. And just bringing this subject into somebody's field of awareness or a company's field of awareness can accomplish wonderful things, not just for you, but for many other people. And maybe you don't want to be an advocate for a lot of other people, but if you do nothing, then nothing will happen. So
Yeah.
um, yeah.
You are your best advocate. You brought something up there, and you're absolutely right. And there's one thing: we're tired of advocating for ourselves all the time. Like we have to justify why we need something, or why we're making a request. That's exhausted, and a lot of people are like fatigued from having to do and self-advocate all the time. And you're right, though, this conversation now is becoming more apparent and more out there now. I've heard more positive conversations around the topic of disability inclusion in the past 5 years than I have through speaking with other people that they have in the past 15 years. So there's
Mhm,
progress
mhm.
being made. So it's no longer accessibility or accommodations is a bad word. It's still uncomfortable. Not saying that's not, but it's,
Yeah.
things are moving forward, and we have to self-advocate.
Yeah, I love that. We do have to self-advocate. And I think one of the things for me that I'm starting to learn is in this self-advocacy piece, there's a part of it that allows me to speak forward my truth, and it creates conditions for success, not just for me, but for people to interact with me. If someone is
Right,
aware that I'm using assistive reading technology, they might not expect me to have to respond to an email within 2 minutes.
right.
Um, so talk a little bit more about what that does to open the larger conversation, maybe with a team or with an organization.
Sure. Well, one thing that I really try to talk to people I work with on is that we're not usually taught how to communicate advocacy effectively, right? We treat
Mhm.
it like I deserve to be here, and there's a lot, we carry a lot of our own feelings with it into that conversation. Yet the person we're speaking with this may be the very first time they're interacting with somebody who has a particular disability or who has a particular need, and they're just not experienced with it. So all of our
Mhm.
years of hurt and pain, we bring that to conversations. That's, again, very normal, and I don't want to shame anyone for feeling that. That's a very normal situation. But becoming aware that the person across from us may have zero knowledge. They may be like, only 10% knowledgeable of what accessibility even is, where we're at our 90%, and we're saying, I've been asking for this for years. Why is it I'm having to ask again? And I know for me, I've been the one who I tried to build a team of accessibility professionals at an organization, worked 9 months for it, built up a team, had credentials, had people ready to be hired. Then all of a sudden they said, budget cuts, right? And then they cut all the
Yeah.
funding from underneath. And it was like, we did so much work. And I moved to another part of the organization. They said, well, we don't know anything about accessibility, so why don't you start teaching us? And so here I am back at ground zero. It's like, why am I starting
Mhm.
again? That's that is a reality of what we do. So I like to say we got to ask more questions of the people who we're trying to make accommodations with, or the people around us. So let's put a situation in here. I'm starting an organization. I've got a team of 10 around me, designers, developers, business leads, marketing, whoever, it doesn't matter who. Just simply asking the question, okay, everyone, what do we know about accessibility? What comes to mind first off?
Mm.
Right? Like we can ask just really simple, open-ended questions to gauge where everyone is. And there's going to be people who have never even thought about this before. And you're going to get other people who say, well, my grandmother had Alzheimer's. And I remember she started forgetting my name, as the youngest in the family, right? That tends to what happens with Alzheimer's, right? You
Mhm.
tend to
Yeah.
forget more recent things over time. So you forget your grandkids' names, then your kids' names, and then your other family members too. And that's what happened to my grandmother. She started forgetting all the grandkids' names. And it was funny for a bit of time. It was, Dan, Cam, James, like she couldn't remember. And it was comical. We joked about it, but then it was like, oh, Nana is having some experiences that we just don't understand yet.
Mhm.
And that is going to come to the surface. And once we start to create those safe spaces, which is really what this is all about, to have conversations about disabilities, we're going to start to create that awareness. So this is not confrontational. This is not accusatory. This is not shaming. Because imagine if you had a team of 10 people who are comfortable talking about it. And that's what I've really found the problem is. We hold it inside. Like, I don't want to talk about that my brother is dyslexic, right? Like he's had
Mhm.
problems, people don't want to talk about that. Not my brother, but I'm just saying, in general,
Yeah, yeah.
that once we start to create those safe spaces for the teams around us, that moves this conversation forward and creates more awareness and creates safer spaces for inclusion and that diversity conversation.
Yeah, I love the point about how it's not confrontational. I mean, certainly there are times maybe it might be, but how it's really just us saying these are the conditions that I'm most productive in. And really, if you
Exactly.
approach it from a place of this is how I work best, instead of I need these accommodations, I'm, this and it's your job, your responsibility, sort of this accusatory fashion can be a lot more difficult to get people to move instead of just saying, you know, I just work a lot better if I'm in a quiet room that doesn't
Right.
have neon lights.
Right.
Or I just
Right.
work a lot better when I have this, $5 a month technology that I can use on a web browser to help
Absolutely.
me read websites.
Yeah.
What would
And
you
can
say?
I want to just jump in and say something like so good.
Yeah.
Like in that conversation that you just gave an example of, you didn't say disability, you didn't say accessibility, you didn't say accommodations. Look at those three words, right? You started talking about maybe what your boss or your leader, it doesn't matter who, is maybe attuned to. And you said, I work better. I am more productive. And I coach people to say, if you're struggling talking about accessibility or things like this to a hard-nosed business person, which is the reality, right? Businesses exist to make money and profits. So if you go into a conversation saying like, let me show you how we can be more productive as a team, and I'm going to start with me. Can we have that conversation? I bet you,
Mhm.
I will put money on it that you will move. You'll have that coffee chat with your boss, and they're going to say, "All right, how can we do this for you?" But there's different ways to approach this conversation, and
Yeah.
that's one that is really successful to me.
So let's say you're a boss and you notice that one of your team members is struggling and you suspect maybe there's some sort of that there's some accommodation they might benefit from. How would you approach that from the opposite end, really, to try to take it into, we're talking about productivity. How does one advocate from the opposite direction?
So keeping everyone anonymous, right? The idea of self-disclosure is a very personal thing. There's many people who choose not to disclose. In fact, I've worked with people who've chosen not to disclose their disabilities when, especially in this field, I could probably identify that they would benefit from certain accommodations or certain ways around. And I would say that it's really important to be respectful and not target someone and say, hey, by the way, I think you may be, I think that you are dot, dot, dot. You're putting things in
Yeah,
space,
yeah.
right? That's not acceptable in any way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
But what we could do is you could send anonymous surveys to the entire team and just say, I'm looking for ways to improve our processes. I'm looking for ways to make a better work environment, working conditions. I've pulled out a list of free things, free tools, free, I don't know, like from a meditation app, something like that, in ways that we could just work better together. What do you
Mm.
think would be a best improvement? So that's a great way that I've seen managers or people leaders open up that safe space. I keep saying that word safe space because it really is so important to learn about your team, because when people feel safe, when people feel that they can trust you, they're going to come to you and say, I'm going to tell you that I suffer from anxiety, and in this situation, like, you can't ask me 2 minutes before a meeting to prepare to talk for 10 minutes. Like
Mm.
that is going to come out naturally when you start to care about your team and care about creating those spaces for people. And again, we talked earlier on about small tweaks. So what could you do instead of messaging people 2 minutes before? Well, that's a self thing that you've got to learn and grow from, and say, maybe I'll email people an hour before. Maybe I'll set up an agenda beforehand with people's names next to what they're responsible for. And we can't put we can't, as managers or people leaders, put all the blame and all the responsibility and onus on our team members, especially if they're not aware or they don't feel that yet. So I hope that gives some
Yes.
information.
I love your point about safe spaces, and I love this for a particular reason, because I know a lot of people can maybe get triggered by that and saying, well, I shouldn't have to create a safe space. This is a working environment. Well, neuroscience tells us that when we're in flight or fight response,
Mm-hmm.
our frontal cortex, everything that does the higher reasoning that helps us do our jobs better, is totally offline. We can't access that if we're in flight or fight response. And if somebody doesn't have sort of a baseline of safety to operate from at work, if you can, you imagine if you were in a cubicle with a tiger the whole time, you would never get anything done. Like, you just wouldn't. And so if we create, what we mean by safe space is creating a space where higher reasoning and critical thinking is more accessible to people. And if you're an employer, I mean, wouldn't you want that? What do you think about it, what I'm saying? What are your
Right,
impressions?
right. And there's going to be certain environments where it's difficult to create those spaces. I mean, I get it. If I'm in a call center or a sales, kind of like, let's pick up the phone and I'll do cold. Do those even exist anymore? I don't know. Like, I'm just imagining, like, Wolf of Wall Street, like, we're all on the phones together in this open environment shouting out. Like, that's high stress situations. But I really, it is up to the manager. It's 2023. It is up to a people leader to create safe spaces. Like, welcome to the modern world. The way that we work is changing, and people expect that. I mean, it's like, we got to get on board. And if you're a people leader, if you manage a team, there are books that you can start to read and grow your own skills. We can't commit to work behaviors and habits back from 10 years ago. We cannot stay static in our ways of leading people. We need to move that forward as well. So if someone came to me and said, well, I don't believe it's my responsibility to create spaces, it's up to somebody else to come tell me, it's like, go back and work at Xerox. I don't know, in the 90s or 80s. Like, that is gone. That type of work environment is just gone these days.
I think you're totally right. And I think, another great point I feel like you made was when you were talking about, it is your responsibility as employer. And even beyond that, we're not just, it's your responsibility. Individuals, if you lose somebody from turnover, it costs you twice as much on average to replace that person. So, you lose someone who has a base salary of $60,000. To replace them, it's going to cost you $120,000.
Right.
So it is in your best interest to make sure that your team has the best working environment and it can work to the highest level of productivity. And
Totally.
I can't remember what the study is, but there's some study that says that 25% of people in the workforce right now believe that they don't have all the tools that they need to do their job well.
Right.
That's a lot.
That's a
That's a
lot.
lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
And can we talk about hiring for a moment? Because that's
Yes.
just something
Yes.
that's really important in the world of accommodations and stuff. The way you tailor your job posting now can be, there's small tweaks out there. Probably it's too much to get into now, but just go do a quick search and accessible job postings or accessible hiring. And if you just front load a lot of those questions around, we talked about before, hey, what makes you most productive at work? What if that was an interview question, right? Instead of you
Mm.
having to force an employee 3 months into their job because they're waiting for probation to be done, right? Like, oh, I can't wait to like finish this. What if you just opened up that and said like, hey, let's have a real honest discussion. Like, how do you work best? Like, our work environment is 3 days a week in the office now and 2 days at home. Which do you prefer and why? How do we create your ideal work environments at the office if that's how it is? Now, we're not going to be able to accommodate all of those, right? I'm imagining startups. I'm imagining large environments that work in maybe an older building, something like that. you can't stop the open office space now if you need a quiet cubicle to work in. But you mentioned a $5. You can go and get earbuds. You can go and get like
Yeah,
noise cancellation
yeah,
headphones. Those
yeah.
have to be very expensive. There's headphones that don't play music, right? They don't have any kind of Bluetooth on them. All they do is play static white noise, and it does noise
Oh,
canceling.
wow.
They're great for anyone who benefits from accommodations that, like, ADHD, who just or prefer to work in that type of environment. Like, I know for me, 45 minutes, if I work in 45-minute blocks of time and then spend 15 minutes chatting with my peers, that was my ideal way. But man, if you bother me while I have my headphones on, you will hear about it.
I love that. I love that. I think in a previous conversation we had, you were talking about, you're a small business and you want to be more accessible. You had some really wonderful statistic about, what a typical accommodation costs. And I would just love to talk a little bit more about, you're a small business, you have 3 employees. How do you start this journey to being more accessible with your employees?
Sure, sure. So 80% of accommodations can be solved with $200. 99% of accommodations can be solved with $400. Now, when we talk about accessibility and disabilities, our mind immediately jumps to, I don't want to say the extremes, but certain types of disabilities. People in a wheelchair, people who are blind, people who are deaf. But there's a lot of other disabilities out there that have other conditions or other that people experience. Some like chronic pain sufferers. Do you ever get a migraine? I get migraines. Like, it's once in a blue moon. I need to work in a certain way, or people who have back pain. Imagine if you go and play sports and all of a sudden you hurt your back. I've worked with someone who he was a chronic pain sufferer because he loved to play soccer, and he couldn't, like, this guy, even when his foot was friggin' broken, he was still outside in crutches kicking balls. Like, that's how obsessed he was with soccer. It was football to him. Sorry, he's from South America. I should get it right. But he would not want to ever stop playing soccer. And it was like, so what worked best for him was a chair that would accommodate how he could rise. Remember those days when you'd go into an office and they would give you like the weak like the most basic office chair? Now you gotta go to an
Oh, yeah.
office and they tend to be a lot better. But
Yeah.
that was back then. It was like, okay, so he makes a request, gets a better office chair, and that was it. Like, how much is an office chair from IKEA? $149? Like, really, the top end one from IKEA.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so what I like to say is that if you're in HR, if you're budgeting or thinking about this, you take the number of employees you have, and you just budget $200 per employee. And yeah, to some employers, that's like, wow, that's a lot of money to put aside. But really, not all employees are going to require that accommodation. Some are going to need more, some are going to need less. And if you just put that money aside as a fund, then you're going to have that always to you if ever an employee needs to dip into it. And maybe someone goes a little bit higher. They need the screen reader, and they need an office chair, and they need a standing desk that's going to run you $400, $500, $600 instead. So it kind of comes that all kind of comes into play. So I recommend to people budget that $200 per employee and just keep that aside.
I love that. And it's such a small number, but can have such incredible effects. I mean,
Absolutely.
$200 compared to having to rehire someone for $120,000. Like,
Makes no sense, right? The
yeah,
numbers,
yeah.
right?
There's a lot of ROI there.
Yeah, and we talk about those dollar figures too, right? There are dollar figures attached to everything in the world of accommodations and accessibility, and there's positive numbers too. We talked about productive workforces and not losing employees, and this is all just money. If we want to talk money, if we want to get to like a hardline business conversation, we can do that too. That's really easy, but there's different ways of opening up this conversation.
I feel like this has been such an incredible conversation, and I almost feel like we should have a series on this, Cam, because it's so relevant now. I want to keep asking you questions. Like, for instance, a question I would love to ask you is, let's say you suspect you have a disability. What would we can't go into that right now, but I would love to have you back on the show to talk more about this. How would you feel about that?
I'd love it. Yeah, anytime.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we've been getting some great comments, and we're wrapping up the show now. If you've joined us just now, we just finished Cam Bodwayne and I just finished talking about disability inclusion and how to advocate for yourself and how to be an accessible employer. And I highly recommend you rewind the video and listen to all of it. It's been informative, especially for me, but I know it will be informative for you. So thank you so much for joining me, Cam. Is there one last tip that you want to give anyone as they're facing this topic?
Ooh, one last tip. I don't know if I can just do one last tip, but this is something, it's always cheaper and more effective to get the conversation started, now it's like that old adage, right? When's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time is right now. So the earlier you can start these conversations, either in your processes, if you're building a new app, thinking about accessibility early on, it's just so much, it saves you so much time and effort. Like no one wants to get to the end hiring somebody, right? Like, I didn't know that you wanted to quit. Why are you quitting? Because I didn't have the accommodations to do my job properly. That costs a lot of money instead of just thinking about it a little bit earlier on. And I know we're all busy these days. I totally get that. But the earlier we can think about this kind of thing, the better it is in the long run.
Well, thank you so much, Cam, for joining me. And I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Tune in again to the Newly podcast. We're going to have another live conversation next week. Talk to you later, Cam. Thanks for
Bye,
joining me.
everyone.